Welcome to another monthly edition of the Ascend Leadership Monthly Webinar Series. Today, we're talking all about communicating with clarity. Now, the other day, as usual, I'm planning what I'm going to say and I'm out walking the dog, and something came up. I was telling Doug about this. Two things came to mind. One was a movie scene, and if you know the movie I'm talking about, drop it in the Q&A because I cannot remember it. But Kevin Hart, I believe, he's in this movie. He's in the scene and he's very stressed. Something, I don't know, action movie or something. And he says something like, "Do you hear the words coming out of my mouth?" Actually, I don't even know if it was Kevin Hart, but he was in a moment of stress and he needed whoever he was, his partner in crime or whatever, to do something, and that person wasn't responding. And I'm going to go with because he wasn't communicating clearly, certainly not with impact. But the other one is a quote that I love, and it's something like, "The problem with communication is the illusion that it has occurred." And so for me, what that tells me is words have come out of my mouth, therefore I have communicated. And it just doesn't work that way. We can use all the best words and we can say all the best things and we can speak in all the best ways. But if you don't understand me, then I haven't communicated, right? And as leaders, if they don't understand you and if they think you don't understand them, there has been no communication, right? You've spoken, but information hasn't exchanged hands. You haven't come to an understanding. All right, let me see if anybody knew the name of that movie. Hold on, I'm looking at the Q&A. Chris Rock, Rush Hour. Thank you. So clearly it wasn't Kevin Hart, because Kevin Hart's the comedian that's always yelling. Maybe that's why I thought. Okay, sorry, distraction. Who am I? Hi, I'm Jana Etienne. And after 26 years in public accounting as a practicing CPA, today I'm a consultant and a speaker and a trainer. And my work is centered on something that I call fearless inclusion. I define that as the freedom to be yourself and the ability to create space for others to do the same. And it requires this clarity of communication I'm talking about, something I call conscious communications. That's communicating and conveying intent while being thoughtful and considerate about how what you're communicating is received. I develop trainings and workshops on that, as well as things like intentionality, authenticity, building culture, ensuring equity. My passion is helping business professionals build deep connections through safety and thrive as inclusive, mindful, and trusted leaders. Now, this monthly series is built around the Ascend leadership model that I created to reframe how we think about leadership. Ascend isn't just a framework. To me, it's a mindset. It's how we show up, and it's the foundation for how I teach leadership. It's how I try to live it. Now, when we talk about communication, it's easy to think of it in terms of those words, right, that come out of our mouths. Or we can think about communication as the techniques we use. But what I hope reminds us here in Ascend is that clarity in communication is not a standalone thing about words and techniques. It's shaped by every dimension of how we lead. Self-leadership. That's what we're leaning into today, because if we're not grounded, if we don't know our values and we can't communicate or convey our emotions, communication gets cloudy, right? Authenticity. That's about alignment, when our words and our actions reflect who we are and what we stand for, because people can sense what isn't true, right? Connection. This is about ensuring that not just transmitting information, but it's being understood. And people feel like they've been heard, which ties into empowerment, because through communication, it builds confidence in others. We can transfer ownership, give agency. Create space for agency, maybe not give agency. Maybe that's not the right word. Navigation. This is how we can move through uncertainty and even communicate as leaders, even if things aren't going the way we planned or the path has shifted and we're not sure. Because when you communicate with confidence, and I talked about that in an earlier session, you don't have to know where you're going necessarily, but your team needs to trust that you will get them there, right? That's part of our clarity of communication. And then decisive action. Without clarity, follow through is empty, right? At the end of the day, Ascend, I position leadership as an outcome. It's not the title we hold, it's the impact we create through how others experience us. And communication is the bedrock of that connection and communication. All right. Let me see if anything else comes in. Jasmine, we didn't talk about this, but could you, if you see anything that pops up as an actual question and not a comment, can you drop that into priority?
I sure will.
Excellente. Thank you. All right. I said I'm going to lean into self-leadership today because for me, this is the root of all of our communication. Maybe I should say it's the source, or, it's about managing self-leadership. So it's about managing your emotions, thinking about your mindset, balancing your energy, and it's the starting point. So self-leadership is a better way. It's not root or source. It's the starting point of our communication. We cannot lead others if we can't first lead ourselves. This doesn't mean we have to be like controlling. We can't be impulsive. Well, impulsive in a good way, not impulsive in a bad way. We don't want to force ourselves into some strict discipline routine. This is about awareness of our patterns and our emotions, the stories that we tell ourselves. This is the kind of awareness that helps us stay aligned with our values and mindful of our goals. This is particularly true in a high stakes moment, but it's also what's behind what's happening in our hearts and our minds in our everyday interaction. So everything we communicate, words, tone, body language, it's an expression of ourselves. So if I'm scattered, right, my message will be scattered. If I feel hesitant, or if I tend to avoid and I'm perceived as somebody who tends to avoid, that's going to shape how others hear me. And if you've ever said something and then laughed it off, I know I've done this. You laughed it off, said, well, that didn't sound like me. That's a sign that you picked up on misalignment, that your words didn't match your own intent and you caught it in real time and were able to pivot. And so self-leadership is what allows us to do all of that. It's that sense of awareness as well as the growth that comes by us reflecting on that. So I did upload, there should be a handout there. Let me do a quick check. Yes, it's called the Communication Alignment Journal, and I'll refer to that a couple more times today. But what that does is it helps us with self-leadership. It helps us with authenticity and awareness so that we can pay attention and notice some of those patterns. Now, if you've ever been in any of my webinars, you know I like to start with a definition because it gives us a shared foundation. Now, most people, when they think of clarity, probably think of something like simplicity, as in trimming all the fat. Or maybe it's get to the point, bottom line. It's concise. Clarity means polished. The dictionary definition, which is what you see here on the screen, is the quality of being clear, such as being easily understood or having a full, detailed, and orderly grasp of something. So according to that definition, it's all of those things. It's simplicity, conciseness, polish, and succinctness. Or maybe it's none of those things. Simplicity might not provide enough information. Conciseness might strip away some critical context. Being polished might feel inauthentic. And so that's why when we talk about clarity in real life, when we talk about communication in real life, we can't stop with just clarity. Clarity is what we get, not how we give it. In other words, clarity has only occurred when I receive what you've said in a way that matches what you were trying to say. I hope that makes sense. So studies show, actually, Jasmine, we were just talking about this. Studies show that people only remember between 7 and 14% of what you actually say. So that means most people remember how you've made them feel and not the things you said to them. The way I described it just a few minutes ago was that if you put words into a computer and then had the computer spit those words out, those words are stripped of emotion. And I must try to understand you based solely on the language, the terminology, and the vernacular. But that's not how communication works. Communicating with clarity can't just be about the words on the surface. It's the things we choose to say and the things we choose to leave out, right? It's not just the message, but it's the tone, the body language, the presence that carries with it. And effective communication is more than that precision that I was talking about. I was struggling to describe some of this as I was thinking about how I'm going to talk about it. And what came to mind for me is messy, right? Humans are messy. And I mean that in a good, beautiful way. We are simple and complex. We are straightforward and nuanced. We are logical and emotional, although in this profession, probably more logical than emotional. We are consistent and unpredictable, clear and contradictory, vulnerable and guarded. You name it, we're all of those things, sometimes in the same conversation. We bring our emotions, our assumptions, and our history into every interaction. And so, messy for me is that what feels clear to me might not be so clear to you. And it can be messy because trust and understanding aren't built on perfectly polished words. They are built on real human connections in moments. And so when we talk about effective communication, all of these words and all of these aspects are things to consider. So first of all, when we say clear, what do we mean? Well, what you intend is straightforward in a way. You're cutting through the noise and you're choosing words that hopefully won't be misunderstood or misinterpreted. We want to be diplomatic. So what does diplomatic means? We're thinking about delivery, not just about what you say, but how you say it. And remember I said earlier, maybe the things you choose not to say. We have to think about transparency, being forthcoming and candid, even if it feels uncomfortable. Sometimes being candid is being kind, even though it might not feel like it, right? Empathetic. This is communicating in ways that is thoughtful about the receiver, considering how it will land and responding to how it actually landed in real time. And then the last one is authentic. People notice when your words and your presence don't align. This isn't about perfection. This is about being genuine and sincere and real. So when I talk about us being messy isn't a bad thing. It just means it's complicated, and we want to try to be as many of these things as we can in order to ensure, or I should say optimize, because you can't guarantee anything, right? So optimize clarity. Now, clarity shows up in different ways depending on the situation. I got 4 boxes here. So in the blue box, it's directions, giving instructions. So making sure people understand not just what to do, but why it matters. Why it matters. Because sometimes people hear only what they want to hear, or they complete the task, but they don't do it right because simply, we know this, the basics, they didn't understand. And that's when mistakes can happen. And so you can get work that technically ticks the box, but doesn't quite hit the mark. Do you know what I mean? There's also another aspect to this. There's the why piece, because the reason we need something done in a certain way, that might be what we need to communicate. It can also connect to a bigger picture, a shared vision, or the mission behind the work. We don't need to tie every instruction to a lofty purpose, but when we do, it helps people see how their part contributes to something larger. Now, when it comes to managing conflict, where being clear on your own style and tension can help the resolution from getting lost in reactivity. So in the middle of a conflict, emotions run high. And if I'm not clear about what I need or what I value or my style of navigating conflict, I can easily slip into defensiveness or avoidance, or you might. So when I'm clear with myself first, I can respond instead of react. And that gives us the space to reach a real resolution. Difficult conversations. That's the one down here. Burgundy, I think. Clarity is important because if we don't, we might avoid naming the real issue. And when that happens, discomfort actually can grow and grow and grow, not just to the point of avoidance, but we just might ignore the problem altogether and it never gets resolved. So think about when we talk about a problem, hoping the other person gets the hint, right, if you will. It rarely works, right? Being clear is addressing something directly with honesty, but care, so that we can move the conversation forward. So here we're talking about also clarity of style, clarity of how we come across, clarity of how we might approach different situations and how that's influencing us right now. Clarity, what is it that we want to achieve? Clarity of how do we want things to go? And then feedback. When it comes to giving feedback, clarity ensures that the message is heard in the spirit that it was intended. Because without that clarity, it can feel personal, it can feel vague, the real point can get lost, right? It also impacts how feedback is received as leaders. Getting feedback is critical and difficult because the feedback that you receive is largely upward feedback. And upward feedback is safe feedback. And so, one of the ways for us to get the best feedback that we can get is to signaling to others that we are open. And we signal that openness through clarity, clarity of communication and clarity of style. So, all right, folks, not a graphic designer. Let's not laugh at the pictures, but hopefully you'll get the point here, right? This is what I pictured when I thought of I say, you hear, we've communicated process. That's what I've talked about. Clarity in terms of self-leadership, feedback, conflict, all of those things. And where, context matters. But the flaw that trips us up is that we assume that because I said it and you heard it, we communicated, right? For all the reasons we just discussed, we can see this view is incomplete because what I say isn't always what you hear. Amazingly, even if you heard the exact same words that I said, I'll give you an example of that in a minute, a little later. The words may leave my mouth, but they pass through tone and timing and emotion and body language on my end. On your end, they're passing through perspective and assumptions and filters and your past experiences with me. So by the time they reach your ear, they might not match what I was trying to say. So communication isn't just about output. So real communication happens as a we, right? And as I said, I'm not a graphic designer. But what did I do here? I tried to pick a couple key elements first. You see, what are those things like chat bubbles, thought bubbles? There's one on each side. Both of us are speaking. Second, you'll notice on the infinity symbol, what I try to do is put the words you listen and I listen wrapped around it because that means both of us are listening to each other. Now, there's different types of listening, and we'll talk about that later as well. But the third and most important piece for me is the infinity loop, infinity symbol. The infinity symbol, there's a balance, right? Both sides are involved, but there's no start and no stopping point. This to me is the illustration that communication is co-created. It's I say something, you interpret it, you respond, I listen, you listen together. Through that loop, we create the meaning. So when we think of communication in this way, it reframes everything, right? Back to that ascend model. Clarity, authenticity, empathy, and presence, they come together. And as cheesy as this sounds, right? Communication, that shape, that space between us, that's where communication really happens. All right, I'm going to pause very quickly and come over to the comments. Somebody said, brings out a sense of chaos with a question. I'm not sure when that came in. Somebody sent me a TikTok video, which I cannot share, but I think that's interesting. To that person, send it to me later. Email, LinkedIn. I'm very curious right now. Somebody asked, if you give a person 2 or 3 choices of something, they will only remember the last thing you said according to research. That is fascinating. I don't recall reading that, but I'm going to have to look into that. And if we know this to be true, it does change perhaps the way we approach a conversation. I have a couple strategies later. Someone else said, I think so many people are worried about how their words are going to be received, so they're not completely clear with what they are saying. People pleasing can get in the way. Thank you for that. That is absolutely true. And so much of how we choose to say things is because we believe that our words are important and they matter. Words matter. Words can hurt. Words can be harmful. But it's not just the words. As I mentioned already, as much as 90% of our communication has nothing to do with the actual words coming out of our mouth. I will sidebar that very quickly with a caveat. When it comes to neurodiversity, depending on the different condition, there are different levels and abilities to read nonverbal communication. And in those cases, in some cases, some people take the words that you say literally. Not a good or bad. This is about awareness and understanding that sometimes when there might be some persistent miscommunications or you're finding it difficult to get to a shared understanding with somebody, maybe there's more at play and there's an opportunity for you to explore. Could it be thinking style? Could it be a neurodiverse difference, for a type of neurodiversity? All right, sidebar over. Let's talk about barriers to clarity. Going back to that infinity loop, if I were going to make it a more complex graphic, there would be little thorns and pricklies along that infinity symbol. And those to me would represent these barriers to clarity, if you will. These are natural tendencies and behaviors that inhibit our ability to communicate a basic understanding of whatever we're trying to share in terms of information. This isn't bad, good, right, or wrong, but what this is understanding that some of this stuff happens. And in our industry and accounting, we're full of jargon, right? It's a sophisticated industry. The work is complicated and challenging. And as a result, so can be our communication. So, and I'm not just talking about technical communication, that's its own challenge, but that's something we need to think about. And it's also, as an industry of humans, we're starting to see AI pop up more and more in our tools and our programs. And I said, right, humans were messy. Well, that human element, it's critical to our collective ability to serve our clients and to serve the public. Human presence requires judgment, experience, and perspective. So AI might be great as a tool, but at the end of the day, we still need to be thinking about all of these little ways we show up and how they can be little, what do I call them, pricklies in our conversation. So assumptions, big problem here. We fill in the blanks with what we think someone means rather than validate understanding. Selective listening, we're going to come back to that when we look at the listening spectrum, but it's basically tuning into only the parts we want to hear. Jargon. Too often we use jargon and lingo and acronyms. And listen, I've been in this industry for a long time, and I'm still sitting in meetings when somebody throws out well, that's an A, B, C, D, E, F, G. And I'm looking around. Does anybody know what that is? We should never assume. And that's one of the ways we can get into trouble. And when I misunderstand and I feel stupid, remember that you said words, you assumed I understood, but not only did I not understand, but now I have some other not positive emotions bubbling up that can be impacting our communication and creating yet another barrier. So there is a lot. I mean, I just talked about emotional misalignment, right? And then filters, past experiences. I'm going to touch on lived experiences later and why it's important for us to understand how those can create filters. Again, no judgment here. This is about understanding different elements and components. Think of this as the ingredients in a recipe. Different ingredients result in different recipes, right? Not good or bad. Other barriers to communication, I categorize these as more internal and external. So think of internal barriers as those things happening within us. So mindset, physical state, emotions, could be behavioral problems. And then there are personal factors like I'm distracted, I'm anxious, I'm feeling defensive, right? And sometimes this is happening and changing in real time. Earlier I mentioned how everything we communicate, whether it's words, tone, or even body language, is an expression of ourselves. And this expression is complicated by any number of these internal mindset challenges. I'm distracted or preoccupied, my message is scattered, right? If I don't care, or if I'm afraid to say something, both of those might show up in my face and outwardly seem to be the same thing, right? If I'm feeling insecure or I don't feel well, it might give off this appearance of indifference. Two different things are happening, but maybe somebody's getting the same impression. Or if I am not clear on my intent, others might not be clear on how to receive me. And so that's why self-leadership, I talked about leaning into that, is so critical. When we are aware of our own patterns, we can catch ourselves, hopefully, before those barriers show up in ways that can undermine our message. External barriers, on the other hand, come from the environment or the context that we're in. So we might work in an office where there are a lot of "we don't talk about that here" kind of rules. Or maybe it's power dynamics. You don't feel comfortable challenging somebody higher up, even when the clarity you could offer might be helpful. You could work in an office. It's in a very, very busy part of town, lots of traffic noise, hustle and bustle on the street, and the sounds are bombarding your space, and it's difficult, can be creating a sense of tension or frustration for you, which shows up in your communication. And then there's technology, right? How many of us work in a distributed workplace today? And so much of what our communication is shaped on is email, chat messages, Slack, something like that. And a lot of assumptions and filters and jargon happen in there. And Zoom, Zoom is what I call digital Botox, right? It has this, there are things that I can do. I don't remember what it's called. There's some kind of like studio effects. I think that's those are called studio effects that can basically brush your face. All of those little micro expressions that we naturally see and pick up in person-to-person communication, gone. And so that's something that we have to think about. All of those can be causing barriers or creating barriers to communication. Now, I don't want to spend a lot of time here, but I did want to make sure I put this on the radar. And so you might have seen this slide in other sessions. And the point I'm trying to make here is really about communicating across difference. And there are two sides of it. So on the left side, you have familiarity with something. But on the right side, you have ability to navigate that difference. So the examples here are cultural differences. These are the types of differences that might be the result of ethnicity or tradition or custom, right? We are aware that those things might exist, but we don't necessarily have fluency to adapt or communicate or build trust across that type of a difference. But another way to look at this, because this is a universal thing to think about, and particularly in expressing ourselves with clarity, simple example, foreign language, right? So awareness, foreign language awareness, you know how to speak Portuguese fluently. Now, cultural fluency, on the other hand, is you can travel to Portugal, carry on a conversation, and move comfortably within the culture, picking up on unspoken cues and understanding the rhythms of daily life, catching up with all the local isms, right? You fit in naturally as an insider, not as a visitor. That's the difference between awareness and fluency. And that difference can influence our communication in terms of effectiveness and clarity and understanding, certainly impact. And then this last picture, I think I talked earlier, I said lived experience. That fluency that I talked about, all those subtleties and cues and isms, those are learned through experience. And even if we share the same experience, our learnings are different because we respond differently to those experiences. So I define lived experience as, bear with me, it's a long definition, but I define it as the knowledge and understanding gained through day-to-day life and encounters, day-to-day life and encounters, encompassing both tangible events and intangible perceptions, emotions, and reactions. It's shaped by an individual's unique circumstances, backgrounds, and interactions with the world around them. So basically, lived experience means someone's lived through something, not just observed it. First-hand involvement. Think about all of these sayings that talk about this. Walk a mile in my shoes, that you can't understand my perspective without stepping into my perspective, right? Iceberg, beneath the surface. I use iceberg a lot. We only see what's above the waterline. There's a whole lot more below, right? Our lived experience is what creates filters. What is the basis for where we form assumptions? It sometimes can lead us to stereotypes. It's what this picture talks about. Many of you might have seen it. Each person here believes that they know what this is because of their experience. So somebody touches the tusk and they think it's a spear. They touch the trunk and they say it's a snake. The ears, it's a fan. The legs, it's a tree. The torso, a wall. The tail, a rope. right? But without the shared and collective experience, they only have part of the story and they reach different conclusions, different lived experiences. But when you pull it all together, you have this really deep and shared understanding. This is a big piece of being an effective, clear, and impactful leader in terms of communication. Because if we do not respect, value, appreciate, and then convey that respect, that value, and appreciation for different lived experiences, we are at risk of, when we communicate, we're communicating one way. And so we're communicating in the way that I heard it, assuming that's the way you need to hear it. So that's something we definitely need to be thinking about all the time as leaders. All right, before I move to this next section, let me see. This is an interesting question. Is there such a thing as a neurodiversity trait wherein some people have issues feeling empathetic toward other people? I tend to think in very logical ways, even during normally emotional conversations, and it gets me into trouble. Sean, I so relate to that. And I say that because empathy is absolutely connected to different types of neurodiversity. And this isn't a session on neurodiversity, and you're welcome to reach out to me afterwards. You have my email and the contact information, or ping me on LinkedIn. Just make sure in LinkedIn you tell me, following up from the webinar. But as two examples, people with ADHD are known to be deeply empathetic. People who have autism spectrum disorder are known to be deeply empathetic. But what they're feeling, the empathy, doesn't always show up in the expression. So it is a very real thing, and it's not our imagination. So thank you for bringing that up, because it's an important difference to understand. All right, so I said clarity doesn't come from words alone. I said 7 to 10% are words, the rest is delivery, right? Clarity is co-creation, as I said before. So I wanted to create this cycle because it's also iterative. From a self-leadership perspective, the communication that goes back and forth between you and I say, you say, and there's that infinity symbol going on. I'm also learning through that loop. So as I know better, I do better, I be better, right? So there are a couple things here in this circle. First, it's intent. Why are we engaging in this? Leaders aren't clear on their intent, risk sending mixed signals before they've said a word, right? So when somebody walks into the room and you're like, uh-oh, this isn't going to be good. Next is motivation. And this one you don't often see when you hear people talking about intention. But motivation is the fuel, right? It's the energy we're bringing. And I'm actually going to break this down here in a moment. Because motivation, I would say, leaks into our tone and our body language and our timing. The next one is intention, and motivation that shapes our intention, right? Without clarity of intention, the communication can kind of feel aimless. People are trying to guess what you mean. Then you have intentionality. So you might mean well, but how you choose to show up and deliver your message. How are you going to say what you're going to say? That's in that handout that I provided. It's to help you formulate some of that, because this is where what we want to deliver and what we actually deliver diverge? Yeah, diverge, right? And reactivity can start to take over. And then the last one is impact. And so this is, how does something land? If it's not what I meant, how do I react to that? Because that's an uncomfortable place, especially if what you said to the other person was hurtful and that's not what you meant. So this cycle is always in motion. And after every conversation, we have an opportunity to reflect and to better understand, so that the next time we can be more clear, right? Now, you've seen this slide in other sessions that I've done, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time here. I actually want to just use it to make to set up an example. So what's the difference between intention, and intentionality? So intent, this is the reason behind what I'm doing. So for example, I want to reconnect with my sister. We've grown distant. So I want us to talk more often and rebuild our closeness. That's my intention. So what am I going to do? I'm going to text her more often. I'm going to make plans. I'm going to see if we want to get together. She lives across the country. Maybe we'll do a girls trip once a year. That's the intentionality. So it's what's driving me. What is it that I'm going to do as a result of what's driving me? And then what are the actions I'm going to take to do that, to make that thing happen? But motivation, this is what's lying just below the intent and pushing the intention, if you will. It's not good enough to have good intentions. And we know this, right? What's that saying? The road to someplace is paved with good intentions. And that place isn't good, right? Intention on its own does not explain why things land the way they do. What actually colors our words, and sometimes even more than our intention, is the motivation. It's our energy source. So it's the emotional or psychological drive that's fueling the action. That could be curiosity. It could be fear. It could be ambition. It could be compassion. So that's why I stuck it between intent and intention. So let's say your underlying purpose is you want to support your team. And your intention is, I'm going to mentor 2 team members for the next year. And let's say your plan is, that's intentionality, is I'm going to schedule monthly one-on-ones. We're going to co-create a development plan, and I'm going to track progress. So I've got intent, intention, and intentionality. But what's the motivation here? Is it compassion? Because you think everybody deserves resources and support to be successful. Is the motivation fear? I want to avoid failure. So I need to do what I need to do to make the team look good, because if the team looks good, I'll look better, right? Underlying motivation changes the tone, tenor, color, taste, texture of intent, intention, and intentionality. And it is directly linked to our communication. So for example, the same words, I want to give, okay, so look, I'm talking to this person over here that doesn't exist. Let's say I want to say to this person that I want to give them some feedback, right, after an engagement. So the underlying motivation, how does that affect us? So if I said, I need to give you some feedback. I want to give you some feedback on that engagement. If the motivation behind that is frustration or ego, it could be, I'm a little more terse. Maybe I sigh. The nonverbal cues are not good. But if it's motivated by warmth and care and concern, maybe I would say, I want to give you some feedback on that engagement. The very tone of that communication changes the way it's received. A couple more things about filters, because I've touched on a lot of this as we've gone through this particularly lived experience, but I think some of these are worth reinforcing. Context. So when a well-phrased message lands differently, it can be a number of things: timing, risk, stress levels. And so we need to remember as leaders that urgency, environment, competing pressures can amplify or distort our words and how what we're trying to convey is received. History. People don't only hear you in the moment, if you will. They hear all of the things that you said. It's the sum of those experiences that people have had with you that is the lens through which they're hearing you now. So this is why, as leaders, self-awareness, particularly external self-awareness, which is how we think, is understanding how people see you and experience you, that's important. And then bias. Listen, we all carry unconscious filters that impact our interpretation. So our intent can be misunderstood simply because of the other person's assumptions and perceptions. And then there's that familiarity versus fluency that I talked about, which is why that ability to express our understanding and appreciation and valuing a lived experience is a critical aspect of clarity in communication. And then this last piece about intention, and then I'll get to some strategies for alignment. This piece, I want to say, is almost the most important part, because everything is great when everything is great. But remember earlier I was talking about you said something and it had an unintended impact, particularly one that was hurtful to someone else. My go-to reaction when I'm having a difficult conversation is defensiveness. I know this about myself, and I have been working on that. It still happens, but I try to interrupt it in real time so it does not carry me off into reactivity and I can stay in responsiveness. But how do we get there? Well, we get there by owning that impact. So reflection, this means on what it is we meant, how it influenced how we showed up, and then reconciling that with what actually happened. If we can go through that process, that's the work, that's the growth, that's how we become better, clearer communicators, right? Now, the handout that I created, the Communication Alignment Journal, it was designed with this particular reconciliation in mind, and it walks us through these three things here on the screen. So the why. Intentions can often be easy to name, but the underlying motivation can be harder to admit, especially if it's self-serving, rooted in fear, ego, or frustration, because we don't even necessarily want to admit those things to ourselves. So naming both intention and motivation, this can help us see whether our words and actions came from alignment of our values or from reactivity. The next is the what. Self-awareness asks us to look beyond what we intended and examine what we actually did. What were the words that came out of my mouth? How did I say it? What assumptions was I making? Were I making? What assumptions did I make, right? And how did that possibly undermine my expression, my communication? And this reflection can help us see where the disconnect may have been between good intentions and expression that led to missed or harmful outcomes. And then the last one is impact. And this is the hardest step in owning that gap between what we meant and how it landed. This asks us to acknowledge the harm and the disappointment that is caused without defensiveness, without excuses. And I'm not talking about with the other person, that is important, but I'm talking about the internal narratives that we develop that we then carry with us and become part of that who we are that shows up in our expression. This is the work. And growth comes not from being perfect, but from being willing to identify and reconcile those differences and then learn from them. Okay, now, last section, strategies. We got about 10 minutes left, so let me pause here. Well, I will say, what do I want to do here? So looking at these 4 areas, it can help us with that clarity in real time. So structure. This ensures that our message is clear. So this is the actual, what are we doing as we craft our message, as we plan for our communication? Sidebar. I was also going to talk to myself in front of all of you, but what does this mean? Well, sometimes this is anticipating a conversation, good or bad, excited, serious, important, fun, doesn't matter. It could mean us thinking about the communication in advance so that we can organize it in a way that conveys the message. Empathy. This is how we stay tuned in to others, right? It isn't just about what I said. We have a saying, actually, I almost put a slide in here that has this picture. In our family, one of our family sayings is, it doesn't matter what I say, it only matters what you heard. And I say that is particularly important because when we talk about empathy, we can't just say, well, that's not what I meant, right? It means that I wasn't being mindful and thoughtful about how this was affecting you, impacting you, or what you heard. Empathy means either being mindful of that in our expression or being responsive to that when it shows up for us in real time. Then there's adaptability. This is how we show up in the moment and how we pivot and how we change. Because I don't know about you, but most of the time I walk into a conversation, even if it's good news, right? I have a plan and I'm going to say it this way. Maybe I want to surprise somebody with something. And then words come out of my mouth a little bit differently than I had planned. And so now I got to change, real time, pivot, right? That's what I'm talking about. This is true regardless of whether these are high stakes or everyday conversations, good news or bad news. Our ability to stay present in the conversation so we can adjust as the conversation progresses. And then the last one is feedback. And feedback is 2 sides. Feedback is confirming they heard what I said the way I intended. And then it's, did I hear them? Right? And is there something that I needed to hear to learn from this conversation? Right? So there are a number of different strategies that we can implement to keep intentions, words, and impacts connected. But first, let me go over to the Q&A. Somebody said this somewhere in the chat, but I think this is a great comment that was caught. A choice of words is a choice of worlds. Hope I said that clearly. Worlds, WRLDS. And that is a beautiful way to think about that my lived experience informs the expressions that I use, the words that I use, the tone of voice that I use, the body motions and language. Sometimes those are very much cultural. And so it's important to understand that this communication from me to you is a reflection of all of that. And so it's a reflection of my world, right? It's a reflection of my background. It's what I said at the very beginning, that our communication is, we're communicating who we are in all of the little things we express every day. All right, so I'm so afraid to click in the wrong place and scroll my screen. Okay, let's look at these strategies. I'm not going to do a deep dive here, but this is the most important one. I always want to say, if you heard nothing else, I hope you heard this, but I could have said that on every slide as we go along. But this one to me is the single most important thing. It's the root of self-leadership, right? What are you bringing into the room? When you are self-aware, or let me make these I statements. When I'm self-aware, right, I can recognize how my mindset, my emotions, and my expectations are shaping the way others are experiencing me. And that allows me to align my words, my tone, and my presence more closely with what I actually mean. Now, remember, I said this is a loop. This is an iterative process. I might open mouth, insert foot, and hopefully if someone is gracious with me, or I'm certainly doing that work I said, where I have to own that impact, next time I might not open mouth, insert foot, or how do I say this? Open mouth and I insert foot, but it doesn't hurt as much. That's probably not a good one. Anyway, here's the trick. It can help me anticipate how others are going to interpret my message, especially with some of that history. If the context, there's pressure or risk or stress, it can help try to interrupt or get ahead of emotions, right? And so that way, instead of me being surprised when a communication goes sideways, I can be prepared for that adjustment and adaptation I was talking about. Self-awareness is the foundation of clarity. And so that worksheet that I created is to help us improve our I factor, I as in me, right? Factor. Because the more I understand about what I bring into the room, the more intentional and effective and clear and impactful my communication can be. Now, visualization. This is one of the most effective tools leaders can use to prepare for a conversation. And sometimes you might be able to do this. I know I do this real time in conversations, especially as you're thinking through how do you respond, because somebody just said something and you're thinking, well, I could say this, or I could say this. And very quickly, if you start to develop that visualization muscle, if you will, you can start to think about impacts. Now, we're not trying to predict the future here. This isn't about rehearsing, because that's going to ring inauthentic all day, right? But what I'm talking about here is mentally walking through an interaction ahead of time. It can help you recognize your triggers, for example, where you might get triggered or sparked or activated in a conversation, where you might be or have a tendency to be reactive or get defensive. This allows us to stay aligned with our intention. Athletes do this all the time. They use visualization to improve their performance on the field. And leaders, we can do it the same way to strengthen clarity, confidence, and presence in the moment. And the worksheet that I created can be used as a visualization tool. It can also be used as a reflection tool, or just a tool to prepare for your conversation, right? This is that listening spectrum that I was talking about earlier, because listening isn't just hearing the words somebody said. We just said 10% of the words, right? 90% body language. So it's listening means engaging fully with the person who you are talking with, giving them your full attention. It means being present and engaging in a way that shows that you truly are understanding. And this spectrum, right? It's not linear. Different situations, different contexts, and it can vary within a situation or in a conversation. I mean, you get distracted. It doesn't mean you're ignoring or pretending, unless you just check out and don't click back in, right? So ignoring is you're just completely dismissing what somebody's saying. Selective, so you're listening to parts of the conversation, but you're ignoring others. Not so good. Attentive is better. You're focusing on what the person is saying and you're making an effort to understand the message, but you still may be focused on your thoughts and your perspective. Active listening is really trying to understand them and engaging, like asking questions and paraphrasing, maybe offering feedback. You're genuinely trying to understand what they're saying. And then empathic listening is you're also trying to understand how this feels to them, what they're experiencing. How do you know you're listening with empathy? Because you can summarize their perspective. You can relate to that emotion, even if you have a different perspective. Or you can understand their experience, not just how you wanted to respond to that. Curiosity is a powerful thing because when our brain clicks into curiosity mode, we click out of judgment mode. When we are curious, we ask questions. We explore different perspectives and alternatives. We are seeking a deeper understanding. So instead of judging, we can stay actively engaged with what's in front of us. So being curious, just asking yourself, what's happening here? Step out of judgment and just more like, to think of it like something called beginner's mind. It's like, maybe I've never heard this before. I've never seen this before. We've never talked about this before. And stepping all the way back to try to understand with a fresh eye, right? Navigating conflict. The key here is, what is your navigation style? What is your conflict management style, right? There's no right or wrong approach. It's you understanding who you are, being authentic and genuine to who you are. But as a leader, it also means knowing how you respond to particular cues or personalities, etc., reading the situation and then adapting in real time so that you can stay connected to your intention. Feedback flows in two directions. I've already talked about this actually several times, but this is tricky. When you're giving feedback, all of the things I've talked about, clarity is important. But I want to focus on the receiving piece, because when you are a leader, you will receive feedback, or quality and the tone and the tenor of the feedback you receive is dependent on the quality and the tone and the clarity and the safety of the feedback you give. And so it's important to remember that, that receiving feedback, if we don't receive this as leaders, we just cannot get better as leaders. What we want to create is what's called psychological safety. This is the space where people feel safe. They don't have to filter. They don't have to hold back. They can ask questions, they can speak up, and they can challenge without fear of retribution or harm. And then the last piece here is acknowledging others. Listen, nobody wants to be ignored. And acknowledging is a way of saying to someone, you heard them, you see them. It does not require you to agree with them. And what happens when we acknowledge others is we can create that space for understanding, and boom, that's where we get to that clarity, that secret sauce. So this last slide here is just a reminder to download those tools. I've tried to take the questions as we go. I'll take a quick peek to see if there's anything else I missed. But before I do that, shameless plug, the next month's session is now open for registration. It's about leading change. It's September the 26th, 3:00 Eastern. I'm always here the fourth Friday of the month, I think, except for Thanksgiving. Maybe that month or December I'm off. But I'd love for you to join me. Same place, same time. Thank you so much, everybody, for joining me.